Hello there, and welcome to Weird Music on the Glumburger channel. This is of course the show where we dive into the weird and unusual world of music that is, out there, on the realms of the internet, just waiting to be discovered, of course. We look at all sorts of different things, I'd like to think so anyway. And in today's episode, we actually have a very unusual album for some reasons. It's one that on the surface is this very oddly pleasant yet incredibly creepy and ominous listening experience. But overall, it's expressing this consideration and awareness for such an incredibly unusual story that has captured the investigative minds of so many people for decades. This story known today as the Dodleston Messages. I'm quite excited to dive into this one, as it's without a doubt one of my favourite releases of this year, and it has sent me down this incredible rabbit hole. I present to you the Leems Boyste by Petteril. So before we get into this, let's ask ourselves, who is Petteril? Well, Petteril is the moniker for UK-based musician James Gilbert, a buzzard spotter and owner of a famously weak pair of ankles. And under this moniker of Petteril, Gilbert has released 2 albums on the New York-based record label Puremagnetik, a wonderful record label that pushes out sounds, experiments and artifacts. And so today, we're looking at Gilbert's recent album release of the Leems Boyste. 5 tracks of experimental ambience that feels so much like a film noir set in the 80s, where peculiar and unusual and unexplainable events occur in the middle of this incredibly ordinary town. It's a rather short album, truth be told. I would say it's more around the length of an EP release, but it's one that just oozes with this incredibly moody presence as it goes from track to track, where it's like the light bulb is swinging overhead, illuminating the shadows against the very back wall. It's easily one of my favourite releases this year, as I've mentioned, and I've been playing this over and over again to myself, and it's, as mentioned, it introduced me to one of the most unusual stories I've ever come across, the Dodleston Messages, which we will talk about a bit later in this video. So, let's talk about the album first, shall we? The Leems Boyste opens up with the phenomenal track, There Is Another Person, or as it's mentioned in the liner notes for the actual cassette, 2109, There Is Another Person. And this is a 9-minute sound odyssey that opens with these peculiar little piano notes, scratchy strings and a pure smouldering atmosphere of foggy mists in the dead of the nighttime. This track is a perfect introduction to the strange and unusual story that is the album's been inspired by, perfectly capturing the incredibly eerie and supernatural happenings in this small town of Doddleston. There's some truly beautiful and captivating moments though, especially around 2 minutes into this. You're getting this kind of mixture of strings, horns and what I think is a clarinet, or it could actually perhaps be a replication of these sounds from a computer, it could be, I'm not too sure to be honest. But in any case, it's without a doubt one of my favourite things on this album, this small little section at the beginning where you're just getting this. It just perfectly captures this incredibly unsettling and spooky atmosphere that's so utterly intriguing. And then the track just fades into sort of more unusual little droning section where it feels like we've stepped into another world entirely, one that's flickering with the sounds of electronic machinery slowly ticking away as its gears and chains just pull it all together. And I love how the more this track occurs and moves along its movement, the more you just get these little oddities, all the more noticeable with each and every listen. Like, the faint sounds of voices discussing something in the very background of the openings, or towards the end, you're getting these faint rumbles and the turning of pages towards the end of the track. And it's a perfect atmospheric opener that immediately pulls you into this strange and unusual world that doesn't really feel like it's it's set in a particular time zone, if that makes sense. Like we'll get into that a bit later. Moving right along though, we get DIRIVVV, a short 4-minute track that further pushes into the captivating and strange miasma of this album. And this one occurs with some incredibly moody tones, I would say. It's offset by these, very unusual little micro sound explosions that sort of act like this percussive beat that's guiding everything along, whilst in the background just voices are chattering, discussing and talking with this unintelligible speech, as though we're perhaps observing this all from another plane of reality, just slipping into this plane of existence and observing it all. And it's so peculiar and unusual, but there's just such a lovely atmospheric presence to the recordings, on this track and in all of them. In fact, it just carries itself through each and every track, and it just pulls you into this really unusual little investigation, if that makes sense. And so on your physical release, this is where you would flip the cassette over onto side B, and where you'd be greeted by another incredibly gloomy atmospheric track, the title track of the album, the Leems Boyste. And for me, this is another one of my absolute favourite things on this album, though, as it just continues those unusual film noir styles of the first track, I feel. And it features this very peculiar little, rumbling, undulating bass motif, and you're getting these gentle hissings and rumblings in the background, accompanied by the scratching and sliding of acoustic strings that creates this really unsettling little experience for us. And I feel like this one, it's kind of capturing the sentiment of an older time period, maybe. It's trying to occupy that space as we moodily remain in our own current time and place, as though, you're kind of just caught between two spaces at once, I feel. It's so unusual how this album does that, with just these peculiar little motifs that call these things up. But it's so interesting, though. It's so interesting. And I think it makes a bit of sense when we dive into what this album's actually exploring. But yeah, it's another highlight on this whole album for me. I just love the constant rumbling atmosphere present in this entire track, and it's so much like that film noir thing, right, where just you're investigating, but it's like more questions are being raised than anything being answered. Let's move on though. We get to track 4, Jewel, which is perhaps the most intimidating track on this whole thing. We've slowly built up to this point, and what you get are these incredible droning synths that sound very much like an organ of some kind. It drones away on specific notes, climbing and falling on others, and then it just stabs you with these terrifying intensities in other moments, as though that are threatening to tear you apart. And there's something almost visceral about this particular track, and it's as though we're witnessing some terrifying existential event that we simply just cannot comprehend. And what I like is that this one's almost futuristic in its tone. It makes a bit of sense when we explore the backstory, but like I said, more on that later. But in any case, you're getting, as intimidating as it all is, you're getting some lovely motifs of the earlier tracks, most notably to me, these drones that remind me, or simply are, I still don't know, that sound like the clarinet. And it's a truly beautiful little tone that creates this incredible atmosphere to what's an already atmospheric track. And yeah, another highlight, one that just pushes forward the very odd little narrative that this specific album has been presenting to us. And so we end up with one final track, the incredibly oddly named True Are the Nightmares of a Person That Fears. And this one, it brings back the piano, creating this swirling whirlpool of notes that slowly gets drowned in effects as we spiral down the plug hole. And it's a few minutes of sort of contemplation as we consider the incredible existential nature of everything that has just occurred, trying to take in all of those details that just seem so fuzzy and confusing, and shape our understanding of it into something tangible despite it being impossible to do so. And this is a beautiful little composition, I must add. It's one that further pushes the really gloomy and murky outlook that the entire album's been presenting. And it's a lovely way to end the whole album, though. It recalls a few of the little motifs of the opening track, I feel, while still continuing the overall narrative, and it ends it on this rather sombre and rather supernatural end, which is a lovely progression for the album to go through, I feel. And so essentially, we've covered this rather short little album that just oozes out this incredibly dark and foreboding atmosphere that's constantly raising questions with this very unusual little mystery. But what is the mystery? What are the Dodleston Messages? What inspired this album, and what the heck is going on? Well, the whole album and the Dodleston Messages is an allegedly true story. An incredibly bizarre little story from the 1980s where a man known as Ken Webster from the village of Dodleston, England, intercepted messages through word processing software on his BBC microcomputer Model B. So through this word processor, he was able to intercept and send out his own messages to a man from the 16th century, as well as an entity from the future known as 2109. And apparently, according to the 16th century individual known as Lucas, he was able to communicate with them through a strange machine in his chimney, which he titled the Leems Boyste, which roughly translates to box of lights, whilst 2109 from the future would describe themselves as, an entity made up of tachyons, apparently. It's an incredibly strange story, but it's truly fascinating. So the events, they may or may not have happened. It's so unlikely that it actually happened. But regardless, though, it was all later published in a book by Ken Webster titled The Vertical Plane, which outlined the entire story as it had occurred and included the very messages from Ken himself to and from these two individuals in these different time zones. To further go into the whole story a bit, the messages continued between the years of 1985 to 86 over, I think it was a 16-month period, when in 86 they just ceased entirely, and with just a final prophetic message from 2109 who revealed there is another person. As well as mentioning that there exists a book written by the 16th century man from before he died, which is still to this day hidden somewhere in Oxford, and would make other worlds not seem so distant. It's also worth mentioning as well, over the years though, as this occurred, experts actually were brought into the house to try and make sense of this goings on, but they were unable to prove nor discount a hoax. So this is, it's a very unusual story. It's so, you kind of just have to, you take what you want from it, basically, Let's before we dive into a bit more actually as well, it's perhaps worth mentioning the notes from James Gilbert himself and what about this? Why did this inspire him to write an entire album about it? He says it very nicely in this paragraph here, which I'm just going to read out for you. The picture that the story paints is so enticing, whether it's true or not, and obviously it's probably not. It's still a brilliant science fiction concept with a really singular mood to it. It's so spooky, dark and gloomy. There's something so appealing about that juxtaposition of dismal grey 1500s England with the green glow of a terminal on the CRT screen of an early stage 80s computer tech, with cryptic future entity harbouring an apparent purpose but reticent to reveal its objective. As the premise of the story unravelled, more and more weird things happened. That feeling of eerie bizarreness just became how I wanted my music to sound for ages afterwards. I wanted to channel the gloom. The visual in my head is so gritty and shadowy. I like that kind of stuff. No, I find it incredibly interesting that such a strange and unusual little story ended up influencing this incredibly dark ambient album, and as a result, it was able to sort of imbue it with this incredibly sinister, unusual energy that just permeates throughout the entire album experience. And there's something so unusual and so unexplainable about everything that had happened and had occurred. And the very story itself, the vertical plane itself, is just so enticing with the very sci-fi notions that it explores when you read it. And I'll also say here, since discovering this album, and as a result discovering this story, this whole mystery and stuff, I have actually slowly but surely been reading The Vertical Plane, which is a very bizarre but rather engrossing little story to read. And the more I read, the more little parts of this very album actually start to make little sense to me, but there's still an entire wealth of information yet to be discovered here. But what I'm amazed though is how this little story from the 80s captured the minds and imaginations of so many people out there though. It's worth mentioning that there was an Out of This World special that aired on the 20th of August 1996, which is an old show presented by Carol Vorderman that I would say reminds me very much of Fact or Fiction Beyond Belief. They basically dramatised the entire story and even interviewed Ken Webster himself, albeit he refused to actually appear on camera properly, but it is what it is. But it's a delight to actually watch this little episode because it kind of it's a perfect little telling of the whole strange story for those who are interested. And as well, I even found a small subreddit that is still discussing, this story to this very day. Although its activity is rather small, they're still talking about, this mystery and how they can find the book and, is it true, is it not, or what's going on? I think there's something amazing about it that, something so weird just brought all these people together and it's still capturing the imaginations of so many people. I mean, including Petteril himself, including James Gilbert, who was inspired to make this little unusual album, right? But yeah, there's something amazing about that, I think, though, that people are still curious about this very strange and unusual event, and they're still offering some very interesting theories and ideas about it, and who knows, maybe it will get solved one day. Who knows? But yeah, I think with that, we're going to come to the end of our, very unusual episode of Weird Music today. This is an incredibly strange little album, but I just love how this just is so delightful for how sinister, unusual and moody the whole thing is, as well as how it's just been inspired by this fascinatingly strange story. And I do genuinely think that this is a wonderful album in terms of how the whole thing sounds though. There's some lovely droning effects, some beautiful instrumentals and some very, stylistic little choices here and there that just, contribute to this really foreboding atmosphere, permeating through the very pores of each and every track as it guides itself through. And genuinely, since this album has been released, I've been listening to it over and over as I just love the setting this album evokes when you hear it. It's one that I feel like is almost capturing the very sentiments of these three different time zones, all occurring over each other at the very same time, and the unusual existential nature of such an occurrence. Before we close off though, it's actually worth mentioning though that when it comes to this album, the Leems Boyste though, purchasing this album actually comes with a surprise for those who enjoy producing their own music, and that is the free Leems VST Audio Units plugin, a plugin inspired by the incredibly strange supernatural events of the Dodleston Messages. How peculiar, yet how brilliant is that then, eh? And so for you viewers there, I've included a whole bunch of links down below to help you out, a link to the album, as well as stuff to the Dodleston Messages, this little story, you want to find out more about this story, I'll say as well though, a recommendation, you can, with a bit of Googling, find a PDF of The Vertical Plane by Ken Webster available online. And it is rather delightful reading the book and listening to this album of the Leems Boyste at the same time. They go very well together, so if you like reading, I would give that a recommendation. So yeah, with that then, I would like to thank you for watching today's episode of Weird Music. I wish you all the best, take care, and bye-bye for now. Bye. Bye bye!